Here's the Broadway Maven's interview with Thoroughly Modern Millie creator Dick Scanlan.
I heard that there is a story about the origin of this musical that has to do with two videotapes.
Oh, that is very true. I didn't know where you were going with it. Yes, in 1988, the summer of 1988, I had a partner who was dying of AIDS, and he rented a beach house for what turned out to be the last summer of his life. And the morning, like Memorial Day, whenever we were going there, I was in a show. I was an actor at the time in New York, so I was joining like a week later, and he was packing up, things you bring to a house, and I'd never been to the house. And he said to me, "Oh, there's no cable TV. They have a VCR, but they have no cable." So, and remember back then, it wasn't like there were like mom and pop video stores that closed at like 6 o'clock. So I was like, "Oh, well, we should probably have videos on hand for people to watch, because if it's 10 o'clock at night and you want to watch a little TV, you can't go to a video store." So we were sharing the house with a partner, not a partner, a roommate, I guess. And Thoroughly Modern Millie had just been on Channel 11 here in New York. It was actually in our VCR. I taped it. So I was like, "Oh, I just popped it out of the thing." I said, "Well, let's bring Thoroughly Modern Millie." And then we called the roommate and said, "Can you bring a videotape to the house?" And he brought the soft core gay porn film Caligula. So my partner died pretty early in that summer. And it sort of, once I got through all the, the memorial and the things that you do, I was like, "Oh, wait a minute, I have this house, this like beach house, and it'd be a nice place to try and heal and grieve." And I went out, and friends would come out every weekend, and they would say after dinner, "Do you have, oh my God, they can't get anything on the TV." And I was like, "Well, we have two movies, Thoroughly Modern Millie and Caligula." And every weekend, everyone would choose, my friends would all choose Thoroughly Modern Millie. To this day, I've never seen Caligula. Although, it's since been turned into a musical. Ironically, about 7 years ago, someone turned Caligula into a musical. I didn't see that either. But so it was seeing the movie every weekend, and I wouldn't watch the whole thing. I would watch sections of it where I got the idea to turn it into a Broadway musical, because I was, I was very struck by the fact that, the movie did not have much of a shelf life. The movie was an enormous hit in 1967, but it hadn't lasted. It's not a classic movie by any means. And yet at the core of that movie these young people who are doing this profound thing, and that is they are rejecting the identities they were born into in order to create identities that feel more authentic to them. And I thought that's so interesting, that in the middle of this not very good movie is something so profound and something so big. And I thought, gosh, if the story could be told better, and that could really be honored, that impulse, that could be a really good stage musical. And that's how the whole thing began. Yeah.
More Dick Scanlan in 20 seconds, but first, if you like learning about Broadway, try the Broadway Maven's Musical Theater Appreciation class, which meets every Monday and Thursday at noon and 8 p.m. Sample classes include Fiddler on the Roof, Mel Brooks musicals, and If You Could See Cabaret Through My Eyes. See the upcoming schedule at thebroadwaymaven.com.
Scanlan is an accomplished fiction writer, journalist, actor, and now dramaturge and playwright and book writer and lyricist, and does all kind of exciting things in the Broadway world. My favorite is he went into a men's prison with a female actress colleague of his and worked with them on a theater project, and it turned into a play called World Inside a Loop, which is extraordinary. So you've really been somebody who can really think out of the box, and I really honor that. And
Thank you.
And I'm glad that you're here. So we started with the two tapes. Now, it seems to me that any musical any movie, including a movie musical, that you need to convert from the screen to the stage is going to have some challenges. You already mentioned that the movie isn't all that good. Are there any advantages in terms of making a bad movie into a musical?
Yes, there are many advantages. And I'm actually working on turning a bad movie, what I think is a bad movie, into a musical, and we're turning what I think is a very good movie into a musical. The bad movie is the movie Funny Face from 1957. It has some charm, but it's a sucky movie. If you haven't seen it in a while, trust me. And the other one is Officer and a Gentleman, which is going to go into rehearsal in about 5 weeks. We're going to do a national tour, and I'm writing and directing that. And Officer and a Gentleman is a very good movie. It's dated, but it's actually kind of a beautifully made movie, beautifully written and beautifully directed by Taylor Hackford. So I actually think it's much harder to turn a good movie into a good stage musical, because you do have to, by definition, a good movie is cinematic. I mean, that's what a good movie is, and theater is not cinematic. We use that word sometimes to describe certainly Michael Bennett's approach to staging and transition, but it is still fundamentally theatrical. It's not cinematic. It's cinematic within a theatrical context. And when you have a bad movie, you have much more leeway. And also, one of the problems with Millie is that it's sort of annoyingly presentational as a film. They're direct takes to the camera. They were playing with all sorts of style in the movie in a way that feels sort of twee and self-conscious. And on stage, that's immediately eradicated, because stage is presentational. No matter how naturalistic you think you're being, you are presenting it for people. So I do think, if you're looking for a movie to adapt, look for a flawed movie. And also, the flawed movie, it's easier to answer the question, why are we doing this? With Officer and a Gentleman, they got it really right. So I really had to search deeply for a reason to put it on stage. I mean, I don't want to do it just to put it on stage. You want to have a reason, something you think you can illuminate that the movie did not. And a good movie, theoretically has illuminated what it set out to. So for example, Tootsie is a great example. I was one of the writers they spoke to about that whenever they were looking for writers. Before they hired Robert Horn. And my big problem with it was like, why are we doing this? I mean, I feel like the screenwriter and the director got it completely right. Like it's gorgeous, that movie. It's a masterpiece, in my opinion. I don't know what I have to bring to this that they didn't do and do really well.
I think somebody brought Groundhog Day to, was it Stephen Sondheim, to somebody who said, the movie is too good. I can't be in charge of making this into a musical. I happen to like that musical a lot, but I can see where a movie that succeeds so well. Now let's just switch our vision to Tony night, okay?
Oh, okay.
You're sitting there. Best book, you're in town. Best score, you're in town. Did you figure you had no chance, or were you holding out hope?
No, I did figure we had a chance, and there was a reason. Why did I think we did? I'm trying to remember. I mean, I remember the night, but there was it? Oh, this is show business. So this is terrible. But I am in show business. That was the revival that year. It was Oklahoma, Into the Woods, and I forget who the other two. And Into the Woods won, I believe. Am I right about that?
I'm not sure.
And I think they did. And it was the same producers as You're in Town. And I thought, oh, I think we won Best Musical. I don't think so. I think that they voted that box for that group of people. You know what I mean? So I actually did, when Revival was announced, I thought, oh, I think we're going to win it. Because remember, we had done well with choreography and performances, and I think we got a design award for Marty Pakladinos's clothes. And so there was a kind of a balance sheet where we had a lot of like experiential, pluses. And then there was like construction pluses that You're in Town had. And when Into the Woods won Best Revival, which I think it did, I think I'm right about that. I was like, oh, I see, it's going to tip in our balance.
Yeah.
So at that, but up until that point, I thought, boy, this could go any which way.
Yeah.
The first award of that night was Rob Ashford winning for choreography, and everyone had assumed it would be Stroman for Oklahoma. So the night began with this enormous, startling, and I think very deserved victory for Rob, whose work was so great on the show. But so we began on this high, and then there were the writing awards that obviously went other ways.
Yeah. So before Millie, and certainly before the Tonys, you were an accomplished Broadway person. But after, you had the Tony show at the top of the world. How did it change your life?
Well, it's funny, David, to change my life in every which way, it really did. But I think it sort of relates back to where I began with my partner dying in 1988. And Michael Mayer, who directed Millie, talks a little, and we've been friends since we were teenagers, so he's known me the whole way through. There was suddenly a tremendous amount of pressure on me to write another kind of hit commercial musical, right? It's one of the weird things about being a writer is that before you have any kind of big success, you're very free to write whatever speaks to you because nobody cares if you write or not. It's just you at your table or your desk or wherever it is you write. And so I had enormous freedom. And then suddenly I felt very constrained and felt like I had to reproduce a certain kind of show and a certain kind of success. And I made a decision really based on my partner's death and my own health at the time, which by 2002, it was getting much better. But, in the mid 90s, I nearly followed my partner. If I had just, protease inhibitors had come out, that's the big class of drugs that turned AIDS around. If they'd come out a year later, I wouldn't have been here. And I thought, wait a minute, this is really weird. When I had no standing, I felt free. Now I actually have standing and could go into rooms and pitch interesting ideas, and I feel straitjacketed. I'm going to choose to take the straitjacket off. I'm going to reject that. And the next thing I wrote was Everyday Rapture with Sherry Renee Scott, which was a very, very different show than Thoroughly Modern Millie. And, I was deeply proud of it. It was an odd, sui generis, idiosyncratic, magical little piece. And then Everyday Rapture did quite well. And so the double whammy of that commercial show and then this odd show then put me in a good place where I'm approached to do both very commercial things, which I do if I'm intrigued by them. And I'm also free to do things like Whirl Inside Loop, which you cited, which are much odder and more, avant-garde, for want of a better word. But I had to go through a process of rejecting the pressure.
Yeah.
Because it was very real. And I will tell you, I see this in younger artists, and I'm going to cite one now because he's doing it so well. The director choreographer Danny Mefford, who did Dear Evan Hansen and many other things. Danny he's a friend, and I'm a great admirer of him as a person and as an artist. But I see how the integrity with which Danny is making his choices post Evan Hansen, where everyone's asking him to do everything. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to choose the things that really speak to me. And I'm like, you go, that's the way to do it. Because then you're going to build a career that you can be passionate about. But it was a process to get there because the pressure is real.
So while we're talking about building a career that you can be proud about, before you arrived, one of my students said, Thoroughly Modern Millie, I always get it confused with the unsinkable Molly Brown. And I said, that's not because of Dick, is it? Because that's something you recently were working on too.
Yes, indeed.
Writing the book.
Yeah, that came about because the guy who wrote the screenplay for Millie and began the adaptation with me before he passed in '96, he died very early on in the process. He wrote the original book for the Unsinkable Molly Brown. So when we were working together, he had asked me if we could go back in and rework it, and I wasn't interested in it. And then he passed away, and his estate asked me to look at it, and I wasn't interested in it. And then Freddie Gershot at MTI called and asked me, and I wasn't interested. And a friend of mine suggested that, look, it kept coming back. And so I called Freddie back, and because Freddie had a very close relationship with Rosemary Wilson, Meredith Wilson's widow. And I said, Freddie, can you give me 6 months to see if there's any way, if there's any door I could open that I could fall in love with this? Because I don't see where I am in this show. Nothing about this show speaks to me. And for 5.5 or 5 of those 6 months, I was really lost. And I listened to the CD so much with the score that my partner finally refused. I wasn't allowed to listen to it when he was home because I just can't hear it anymore. And so not that the score isn't good, it's just when it's over and over. So then I went out to Colorado to research. I thought, what's based on a real person? So I wonder what that is. And I went out to Colorado for several weeks and did pretty extensive research. And I discovered that there's really 2 Molly Browns. There's this mythological one, which is the one from the 1960 version. Then there was the real person who was much more interesting and was this, committed social progressive and this really interesting pioneering feminist. And so I called Freddie, and eventually Meredith Willson's widow, I said, if I can start over, like tell a completely different story that's based on the historical Molly, using Meredith's music and maybe having to rewrite some lyrics and stuff, then not because the lyrics weren't good, but because they had to be right for this story, I could do this. And that's how that all came about. And I ended up being very proud of that show. And Beth Malone was so brilliant as Molly Brown, just so brilliant, incredible, actually.
Thank you. Now, when you co-write a book, how does it work? Do you send a lot of emails back and forth? Do you sit in a room and bang it out? How do you?
I don't often co-write a book, but I did it certainly with Richard in the early days, and I've done it with Sherry Scott. With Richard lived in LA and he was elderly and housebound. So I would basically work on it in New York and then FedEx him. This was before emails, packets of material. And then I would go to Los Angeles every, say, 3 months for anywhere from 5 days to 2 or 3 weeks, where we would meet every day in a room. When Sherry and I worked together, by and large, it's in a room. It's almost like an extended, year-long improv process. And then that doesn't mean at night when we get home, if one of us doesn't have an idea, that we don't text or email the other and say, hey, what if? But we spend a lot of time together in a room, kind of batting it back and forth and, trying to, and by the time you write the line down, it's hard to even know who wrote it, because I have a thought and she has a thought, and we bat it back, and then we arrive at a line. But if each of us hadn't done our batting, we wouldn't have arrived at that line. So you don't really feel ownership of a particular moment. The two of you feel ownership of the whole thing.
So
ideally.
I really liked Millie, the musical. I actually liked some parts of the movie better than others, but I was a little sad when you couldn't work in the Yiddish number into, come on, that was really fun.
I know it doesn't have much narrative musculature, though. The reason the Yiddish number is in there, the Jewish wedding song, is because, when Julie Andrews signed on to do the movie, she was such a big star. They wanted to make it what they called it a roadshow movie, which had an intermission. And I think they charged $5 a ticket, which in 1967 was, movies were what, 75 cents, something like that. So $5 was huge. But in order to do that, they had to make it longer. So and I think it was was it Joe Layton that choreographed the movie? I think it was. Whoever choreographed it was like, when I was a kid, my sister and I used to make money dancing at Jewish weddings. Yeah. And it would be really funny if Millie goes and sings at a Jewish wedding. So that's how that came about. It was simply there to make the movie longer so that it could qualify as a roadshow feature.
I see. Tell me a little bit, I don't know to what degree you were involved in casting or deciding the nature of the cast, but how did the decision come about to make Muzzy African American?
That was my decision, and I was very involved with the casting, and I always am, because I direct as well. So I sort of, and not that when I'm a writer, the director is the director, and I'm not, but I can't. It's all one head. We did a reading of the show early on with someone who was not African American, and it was there's a known actress whose name I won't say because it was not a successful performance, and I realized how vapid and unnecessary the role could be, that so much of the success of it in the movie is Carol Channing, and it was written for Carol. Richard Morris and Carol were friends, so it literally was written for her, and she's so brilliant and she's so astonishingly talented, and so she was filling in with her persona huge gaps in character development. And I thought, oh, this is a real problem. And at that time, I was reading a book called Terrible Honesty, Mongrel Manhattan in the 1920s by Ann Douglas, which was about New York in the 20s. And it focused a lot on the uptown, downtown, the kind of way that Harlem culture came down to cafe society. And, very, very wealthy white people were going up to Harlem. And there was this kind of cross section. And then by extension, the larger idea that historically in our country and perhaps other countries, one way to overcome the limitation of opportunity imposed by racism is to be extraordinarily gifted, either in the arts or, of course, in athletics, right? And something that you can show somebody you can do. And so I thought, oh, it'd be really interesting if that's who this character was. It just, and then the moment I did, I realized that it sort of linked her to Millie, that she was yet another person who had reinvented herself and had decided that whatever life she was born to lead just wasn't going to fit her, and she'd gone out and made a whole other life for herself. So that's sort of how and also it made the kind of ruse of the show, you know, that her being their stepmother makes the audience never suspect that Muzzy has any familial relationship with Jimmy and Miss Dorothy, because of course we all walk into the theater with our own racism, and we don't see an older Black woman and two young white people and think, oh, they could be related, when of course
at the end of her life we found out that Carol Channing was part Black, which is so
that's right. So that's how that came about. And it was, it was fairly early on in the show's development. It was after a very specific reading that we made that decision. And then we kind of rewrote the character accordingly.
So one more question about casting, and then I want to see what students have to say. And that's, I understand that there's a very Broadway story about how Sutton Foster got that job.
Yes, no, there is. I mean, you know, it was a really challenging situation. I will say throughout the development of the show, Michael Mayer would say, who's going to play this? And I'd be like, I don't know. And for a while, Kristen Chenoweth was attached. Although Kristen, interestingly, was originally cast as Miss Dorothy for a reading. And then the reading was postponed. And then she did Charlie Brown. And it just seemed like there's no way that Kristen can walk on stage and be the friend, you know, and she's such an event. So she became Millie, and she was quite brilliant. I have to tell you, she was riveting and wildly funny. But I don't know that we ever thought she was essentially this character. She's she's just a genius. So then she got her TV show, her first TV show, Kristen, which I actually wrote the theme song for, Rich and Sorry. And we went off to La Jolla, and we had a series of auditions, and Sutton had done a reading for us in an ensemble track, and it impressed us all greatly, really very greatly. But in the audition process, for whatever reason, and I think the big reason, honestly, is that the script wasn't soup yet. And so the scenes people were auditioning with weren't very good. And that's on me, completely on me, because Sutton sang like a dream and she danced well, but we just weren't seeing what we thought we needed to see. And we ended up casting another actress who's very talented. And we went out to La Jolla, and at a certain point, it just wasn't working out with the actress we hired. And Sutton was, there, and sort of, we had an opportunity one day for her to show us what she had. And it was like, oh, I see. I think maybe that was the person we should be using. So we made a change, and it was painful. And, and someone got hurt who shouldn't have, because they're really, really talented. And then Sutton, ended up being exactly, I think, what the role needed. I mean, she really was essentially, fundamentally, in a profound way, perfect for the part. We did a reunion concert of it about 3 years ago for the Actors Fund with the original cast. And seeing Sutton's performance again, it was really towering. It was quite a brilliant performance as Millie.
Excellent. I want to introduce you to Alex Salkin. Alex is my co-host. And
hey, Alex.
How you doing?
He's been tracking student questions. So Alex, you want to introduce a question or two?
Absolutely. We've got 3 in particular, and the first one comes from Stephanie Keys. She says, or she would like to know, if you had to get permission to use Gilbert and Sullivan for the typing test, or is this public domain? It was very clever in any event. I love that show.
Oh, well, thank you for the compliment. And no, I did not have to. Gilbert and Sullivan was public domain, and it was there because it was my idea to do that. And Richard Morris was still alive. And I called him because we were in the movie, it's Babyface, and it's Millie sort of gaga at how handsome Trevor Graydon is. And that just didn't seem very theatrical because, once she goes gaga at him, there's no more information in the song. And so I thought, no, we got to get to know him. So what if he does a typing test and we use a Gilbert and Sullivan patter song? And Richard said, no, I hate Gilbert and Sullivan. I can't stand them. And I was like, but that's not a very mature reason to, I don't actually accept the reasoning for the no. And he said, well, if you can do it, if you can sit down and write lyrics that are a well-composed business letter that end with a rhyme with the word Graydon, because the last word has to be the boss's name, I will consider it. And I did.
Tell the students what your rhyme was.
Well, it's all about the letter is all about they've re-waxed the floor and the floor wax is rancid. And he's like, and we will have our floor relayed, and if you do, you may, and if we do, you may expect a bill. Sincerely, Trevor Graydon. So it's relayed and
Relayed.
yeah.
Very good.
That's what it is, I believe. Somebody could correct me, but I think that's what it is. So anyway, that's how it happened. It's
a good touch, but it's a great touch when it becomes at the end of the show a key plot point.
Yes. Yeah. She stenogs it at the end.
Yeah. Alex, what else do we have?
All right, this next one comes from Jeremy Sunderland, who asks, what role, if any, did Anne Hamburger, artistic director of the La Jolla Playhouse at the time, and Whoopi Goldberg play in Thoroughly Modern Millie's development?
Well, very interesting question, very specific. Anne Hamburger played a huge role in that she gave us a slot. You know, she was the one who said, hey, come to our theater and do it. By the time we got there, you know, Anne only lasted, I think, one season at La Jolla, and she actually left during our rehearsal process. She got hired by Disney to oversee their theme park division. So I think she left maybe 2 or 3 weeks. So she left before Sutton was hired, for example. When she left, Sutton was not the lead. She left maybe 3 weeks into our stay. So in terms of what artistic directors can do in the process in the room, I'd say Anne had little impact because she really wasn't there. But my goodness, she gave us the slot. She believed in us, and that's everything. And then Whoopi played a crucial role, and that is, you know, in the late 1990s, when we were doing this, movie companies did not want their shows turned into musicals. They had yet to understand the amount of profit it could generate for a movie company. There hadn't really been, remember, it was before the producers, because that was 2001, I believe, and we were 2002, I believe. Something like that, or maybe producers was 2000, something like that. But they hadn't understood that there was this huge revenue stream. And so they would just say no to everything. And so we needed the approval of the movie company, and we just kept going on faith that somehow we were going to get it. And when Whoopi came aboard, which was fairly early on in the show's development, the thing she did was call, I think his name was Ron Mayer, the head of Universal, and say, Ron, it's Whoopi, I want to produce a stage version of Thoroughly Modern Millie. Can you just make this happen? And he said, sure. Mm-hmm. And it cut through, you know, all the people underneath whose impulse would be to say no, because saying no is always the safe choice, because if you say no, nothing happens, so nothing can go wrong. If you say yes and something goes wrong, you can be blamed for it. So yeah, it was, you know, Whoopi played a huge role in it. And then she was she was around. She would come to rehearsals. It was obviously very exciting for the cast when she would come, and she was at openings. She was very much present, and she would give her thoughts. They were smart. She was amazing. She really was. She was a delight to work with.
Thank you. And the third one, Alex?
All right. Third question is, this one is from Drew Thompson, who asks, were any of the songs for Thoroughly Modern Millie written specifically with Sutton Foster in mind?
Oh, sure. Yes. The first song we wrote for Sutton after she was hired was because we kept saying there'll be a song here and we don't know what it is. And then we hired Sutton, and that was Gimme Gimme. So Gimme Gimme was written for Sutton. The song Not for the Life of Me was written for Sutton. The song I Turn the Corner was written for Sutton in a certain way. Although it's more Jimmy's song than hers. I think to some degree how the other half lives, but really the two big ones are Not for the Life of Me and Gimme Gimme. And of those two, Gimme Gimme. And Forget About the Boy was written for Kristen Chenoweth. That was
how do you write a song with an actress in mind? How does that become different than if you don't write it with an actress in mind?
Well, specifically with Gimme Gimme, you know, it was very challenging, right? Because you're trying to write an 11 o'clock spot. So it has an assignment. There's something it has to do, you know. But one of the things that sort of blew us away about Sutton's voice was that Sutton is one of the few singers whose voice is as beautiful at 2 as it is at 10. Her voice is beautiful at every single, beautiful and musical and connected to her soul at every single, number on the volume dial. And I said to Janine, I'd love for us to write a song where that begins at, 1 and goes to 10. And Janine said, well, we can do that, but then the song has to do it. It has to earn that. It has to literally dramatically demand to start at 1 and demand to end at 10. And that assignment is where we got, it became the idea for the song for Gimme Gimme. Whereas, not every 11 o'clock spot begins at 1. They often don't. They often begin at 7 and end at 10. But so we specifically wrote it to take her voice through a journey, knowing that her voice does that so well.
I'm so glad you joined us. I'll tell you, the thing that I learned the most is that it's easier to create a musical out of a bad movie than out of a good one. I had never thought that through. And
good. I'm glad there was some learning, and I really appreciate your very smart questions. Clearly, your viewers are savvy theater people and art people, because Someone is saying, could you explain the songs being 1 to 10? I'm talking about like on a volume dial. So I'm talking about volume being 1 to 10.
Who's willing to be my first Patreon supporter? Click here to see my interviews with Lynn Ahrens and with Mark Shaman.